A black woman threatened with police in first class. Turns out she's the airline's biggest investor. Sometimes, a single moment can reveal the true nature of those around us. On what should have been an ordinary flight, Sarah, a poised and successful businesswoman, was quietly targeted by someone who underestimated her. But this wasn't just about one woman in first class. What unfolded would shake an entire company and leave everyone watching stunned. Before we begin, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. If you love inspiring stories of resilience and justice, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible tales. Your support helps us share these impactful stories with even more people. Now let's get into it. The soft hum of the airport was a familiar, yet bittersweet melody to Sarah. She stood in the bustling terminal, her figure straight and poised, a quiet contrast to the chaos around her. Her tailored navy blue blazer and crisp white blouse spoke of elegance, while the understated pearl necklace at her throat hinted at an inner strength forged through years of resilience. Sarah's deep brown eyes swept across the departure board, her gaze sharp but serene. There was a quiet wisdom in her expression, the kind that came from knowing too well the weight of expectations placed upon her. Her caramel skin seemed to glow under the terminal lights, a radiant symbol of her pride in her identity. She carried herself with a grace that turned heads, though not always for reasons she welcomed. People often paused when they saw her, their gazes lingering too long, their expressions a mix of admiration, curiosity, and something unspoken, a hesitation, an assumption, a silent question. What is she doing here? Sarah had learned to navigate these stares long ago. She let them glance off her like rain on a well-oiled coat, refusing to let them seep into her. Yet, today, as she stood in the crowd waiting to board her flight, the air felt heavier than usual. Her hands rested lightly on the handle of a sleek leather carry-on, her manicured nails painted a muted rose. It was a small indulgence, one of the few she allowed herself in a life spent proving her worth to people who doubted her. At first glance, Sarah didn't need extravagance to announce her success. She let her presence speak for her, her confidence filling the spaces where words might falter. A child nearby tugged at his mother's sleeve, pointing at Sarah with innocent curiosity. "Mom, is she a movie star?" the boy whispered, his voice carrying over the hum of the terminal. The mother shushed him gently, offering Sarah an apologetic smile. Sarah returned it with a slight nod, her lips curving into a polite but distant smile. She had grown used to moments like these, where she became an object of fascination simply by existing in spaces some believed she didn't belong. But Sarah did belong. Her journey to this point had been neither smooth nor linear. She'd grown up in a small, segregated town, where the odds of success for someone like her were razor thin. Her father, a soft-spoken teacher with a spine of steel, and her mother, a nurse who never stopped fighting for her patients, had instilled in her the values of hard work and self-respect. Those lessons carried her through the storms of life, the barriers, the double standards, the incessant need to outperform others just to be seen as equal. It all built a resilience in her that was unshakable. Now, as a major investor in the airline industry, Sarah knew she had earned every seat at every table she chose to sit at. Today's flight was no exception. She had planned this trip meticulously, a brief reprieve after months of meetings and negotiations. Her ticket read first class, but for Sarah, it was more than a seating arrangement. It was a statement. It was a space she had fought for, not just for herself, but for those who would come after her. She knew the significance of her presence in that cabin. Still, her heart carried a quiet ache. The road she traveled had come with sacrifices, time with loved ones, the burden of always being the one to pave the way. But, as she adjusted the strap of her carry-on and moved toward the gate, her posture remained impeccable, her resolve unyielding. She caught her reflection in the glass of a nearby storefront and paused for a brief moment. She looked at herself the way she had learned to look at the world, directly, without flinching. What she saw was a woman who refused to be underestimated. The announcement for boarding crackled through the speakers, and Sarah straightened her shoulders. It was time. As she stepped into the line for first-class boarding, she felt the faintest flutter of tension in her chest, not because she doubted herself, but because she had seen this story play out before. The looks, the comments, the quiet challenges that demanded her to prove, again and again, that she belonged. But Sarah didn't brace herself. She didn't need to. She moved forward with the calm of a storm that knew its power. Whatever awaited her on that plane, she would face it with the same grace and strength that had carried her this far. She was Sarah, and she was unshakable. Sarah's heels clicked softly against the polished floor as she approached the gate. The line for first-class boarding had already begun to move, a small but deliberate procession of passengers. She adjusted her blazer, pulling it snug over her shoulders, her carry-on gliding smoothly behind her. The gate agent barely glanced at her ticket. A quick scan and a monotone, "Have a good flight," were all Sarah received before being ushered down the jet bridge. She noticed the difference immediately. The agent's demeanor lacked the warmth she had offered to the passengers ahead of Sarah. An isolated oversight, Sarah thought, pushing the moment aside. The first-class cabin was pristine, its ivory leather seats gleaming under soft ambient lighting. Sarah's eyes swept the space, taking in the subtle luxury that she had earned the right to enjoy. As she approached her assigned seat, 1A, she noticed a flight attendant adjusting the overhead compartments, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp features and a crisp uniform. Her name tag read Helen. Helen glanced over her shoulder, her eyes narrowing slightly when they landed on Sarah. There was a pause, a barely perceptible flicker of something unspoken, before she plastered on a tight smile. "Can I help you?" Helen's tone was polite but tinged with a question that wasn't spoken aloud. "No, thank you," Sarah replied evenly, placing her carry-on under the seat in front of her with practiced ease. She settled into the plush leather seat, smoothing her skirt over her knees. Helen lingered, her gaze shifting to the seat, then back to Sarah, her expression tightening. "Are you sure you're in the right section?" she asked, her voice lower now, as though trying to make the question seem casual. Sarah froze for a moment, her fingers stilling on the buckle of her seat belt. She lifted her eyes to meet Helen's, her expression calm but unwavering. "I am," she said simply, pulling her boarding pass from the pocket of her blazer. She handed it to Helen, who examined it with a frown, as if hoping to find an error that would validate her question. Helen handed the ticket back with a clipped, "Very well," and walked briskly to the next passenger. Sarah exhaled slowly, not out of relief, but out of irritation. Already, she thought. She had hoped for at least a moment of peace before the microaggressions began. The cabin filled quickly. Other first-class passengers, mostly older, mostly white, settled into their seats, chatting softly or scrolling through their phones. Helen moved among them, her demeanor noticeably warmer, her smile more genuine. She stopped at the man seated next to Sarah, a middle-aged executive type, and offered him a drink menu before glancing back at Sarah as though debating something. Finally, Helen turned to Sarah. "Excuse me, ma'am, but we do ask that you keep your belongings within the allotted space," she said, gesturing to Sarah's carry-on, which was neatly tucked under the seat in front of her. Sarah blinked, momentarily confused. The bag was well within the guidelines. She had flown enough to know the rules, and she had followed them precisely. "My bag is in the correct place," she replied, her tone calm but firm. Helen's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll need you to move it to the overhead compartment," she said, her voice taking on a sharpness that hadn't been present moments earlier. Sarah straightened in her seat, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I prefer to keep it with me, as allowed," she said. "It's within regulation size, and it's not obstructing anything." Helen's eyes flickered with annoyance. She looked around, as if searching for someone to back her up, before leaning in slightly. "It's a matter of space, ma'am. We need to ensure everyone is comfortable." Sarah's jaw tightened. She held Helen's gaze, her voice low but unyielding. "I believe I'm entitled to the same comfort as everyone else." The tension between them was palpable now, a quiet battle of wills that seemed to draw the attention of nearby passengers. The man beside Sarah shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the two women but saying nothing. Helen straightened, her expression hardening. "I'll have to ask you to comply," she said, her voice louder now, drawing more attention. Sarah felt the weight of the cabin's gaze on her, the familiar heat of scrutiny, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned back slightly, her voice steady and measured. "I'll comply when it's necessary. Right now, it isn't." Helen's face reddened slightly, her professionalism slipping for just a moment. She opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by another flight attendant, who approached quickly, sensing the growing tension. "Is everything all right here?" the second attendant asked, her voice calm and diplomatic. Helen stepped back, composing herself. "We're just discussing the placement of this passenger's belongings," she said, her tone clipped. The second attendant looked at Sarah's bag, then at Helen, her brow furrowing slightly. "It's fine where it is," she said softly. Helen's lips tightened further, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned sharply and walked away, her heels clicking loudly on the cabin floor. Sarah exhaled slowly, her composure intact, but her patience wearing thin. She glanced out the window, the sprawling tarmac below shimmering in the afternoon sun. It was going to be a long flight. Sarah adjusted her seat belt and inhaled deeply, forcing herself to focus on the view outside. The jet bridge was now clear, and the crew began their pre-flight announcements. The flight attendant who had intervened earlier returned briefly, offering Sarah a small smile before moving on. It was a gesture of reassurance, though fleeting. Sarah was no stranger to moments like these, but each encounter added another stone to the mountain she carried. She reached for the small travel book she had tucked into her carry-on, hoping to lose herself in its pages, but peace wasn't in the cards. As the flight attendants began their first-class service, Helen returned to the cabin with a tray of welcome drinks. Her smile had returned, though it lacked any warmth when her eyes landed on Sarah. "Champagne, orange juice, or water?" Helen asked the passenger across the aisle, her voice light and cheerful. The man chose champagne, and Helen handed it to him with an easy laugh. When Helen reached Sarah, her expression changed. "We're out of champagne," she said abruptly, cutting off Sarah's choice before she could speak. "Orange juice or water?" Sarah glanced at the tray, where 2 glasses of champagne were still clearly sitting. Her eyes flicked back to Helen, her brow arching slightly. "Orange juice is fine," Sarah said after a moment, her voice calm but tinged with weariness. Helen handed her the glass without a word, her eyes darting away quickly, as though she couldn't bear to meet Sarah's gaze for too long. Sarah took the glass and set it on her tray table, her appetite for anything fading with the tension in the air. The next affront came during the meal service. Helen approached each passenger with an elaborate display of professionalism, carefully reciting the menu options and ensuring their preferences were noted. "Ma'am, we have a choice of grilled salmon or roasted chicken, both served with seasonal vegetables," Helen said sweetly to the woman seated 2 rows ahead. "Would you like to pair that with a white wine, or perhaps our sparkling water?" When Helen reached Sarah's seat, the shift was immediate. "Chicken or fish?" she said curtly, her tone devoid of the enthusiasm she'd shown to the other passengers. Sarah hesitated for a fraction of a second, caught off guard by the stark difference in treatment. "I'll have the salmon," she replied evenly. Helen nodded sharply and moved on without another word, not bothering to offer Sarah the drink pairing she had provided for everyone else. The man beside Sarah gave her a sympathetic glance, but remained silent. Sarah, for her part, straightened her posture and turned back to her book, determined not to let Helen's behavior rattle her. But the meal, when it arrived, was served hastily and without the attention to detail afforded to the other passengers. The tray was placed unevenly, and Sarah noticed the butter was missing from her bread plate, an oversight that Helen likely wouldn't have allowed for the others. Midway through the flight, Helen returned with a stack of blankets and pillows for the first-class passengers. She distributed them with a smile that faltered only when she approached Sarah. "Do you need a blanket?" Helen asked, her voice flat. "Yes, please," Sarah replied, keeping her tone polite. Helen handed her a blanket, but as she turned away, she paused, glancing back. "You'll need to make sure it doesn't hang over onto the next seat," she said, her tone sharp. "It's important to respect everyone's space." The comment hung in the air, unnecessary and pointed. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she refused to rise to the bait. The man beside her shifted uncomfortably, finally speaking up. "She's not taking up any more space than the rest of us," he said softly, his voice carrying just enough weight to make Helen stiffen. Helen flushed slightly, but didn't respond. Instead, she turned on her heel and disappeared toward the galley. The culmination of Helen's behavior came when Sarah politely rang the call button to request water. The light above her seat blinked for several minutes without response, though Helen passed by twice without acknowledging it. When Sarah finally managed to catch Helen's attention, the flight attendant sighed audibly, walking over with exaggerated reluctance. "Yes?" Helen asked, her tone laced with impatience. "I'd like a glass of water, please," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. Helen rolled her eyes. You could have waited until I was already in the aisle, she muttered under her breath. I beg your pardon? Sarah asked, her tone icy now. Helen blinked, startled by the steel in Sarah's voice. Nothing, she said hastily, retreating to the galley. When she returned, she placed the glass of water on Sarah's tray with a clatter that drew the attention of other passengers. Several pairs of eyes turned toward the interaction, their curiosity palpable. Sarah's patience was wearing thin. She could feel the indignation simmering beneath her composed exterior, a fire she had spent years learning to temper. But Helen's behavior wasn't just an attack on her. It was an attack on everything she represented. She folded her hands in her lap, her mind working through the situation with precision. There was no need for an outburst, no need to lower herself to Helen's level, because Sarah knew something Helen didn't. And soon, the storm brewing within her would find its release, not in anger, but in justice. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane reached cruising altitude. The hum of the engines filled the air, a steady background noise that should have been calming. Yet, Sarah sat rigid in her seat, her hands resting on the armrests, her fingers gently tapping a rhythm of unspoken frustration. She had remained composed throughout the series of microaggressions, but the weight of the day had started to press down on her like an unwelcome guest. The other passengers seemed blissfully unaware of the tension Helen had created, absorbed in their own conversations or in-flight entertainment. Sarah, however, couldn't escape the pointed glances and the thinly veiled hostility radiating from the flight attendant. It lingered like an unwelcome shadow. Helen reappeared in the aisle, carrying a tray of steaming coffee pots. Her demeanor shifted again as she approached each passenger, all smiles and soft words. When she reached Sarah's row, the change was immediate. Helen's smile disappeared, replaced by a tight-lipped expression that barely concealed her disdain. Coffee or tea? Helen asked, her tone clipped and devoid of the warmth she had shown the others. Coffee, please, Sarah replied, her voice calm but firm, refusing to let the treatment rattle her. Helen poured the coffee, the stream of liquid teetering dangerously close to the edge of the cup. Sarah watched the small act of carelessness, her lips tightening slightly. Helen placed the cup on the tray table with a loud clink, her eyes avoiding Sarah's. Without waiting for a response, she turned and moved down the aisle, leaving Sarah to silently regard the steaming cup in front of her. The final insult came when Helen returned to the cabin to hand out feedback cards to the first-class passengers. She moved through the rows, her demeanor once again warm and cheerful, as she explained the importance of customer feedback to each person. When she reached Sarah, her tone changed. You can skip this if you'd like, Helen said, barely glancing at her. It's mostly for regular passengers. The words hung in the air, a deliberate cut meant to undermine Sarah's presence. Sarah froze, her grip tightening slightly on the armrest. This time, the insult wasn't subtle. It was loud, deliberate, and calculated. I wasn't aware that feedback cards were optional for first-class passengers, Sarah replied, her tone sharpened enough to cut through the hum of the cabin. Her eyes locked onto Helen's, unflinching and steady. Helen's face flushed slightly, but she recovered quickly, offering a forced smile. It's just, they're more relevant to frequent flyers, she said, her voice faltering slightly. Sarah's gaze didn't waver. I am a frequent flyer, she said evenly, her voice carrying a quiet authority that made Helen hesitate. And I'll be happy to provide feedback on today's experience. The passengers in the nearby seats shifted, sensing the growing tension. The man beside Sarah looked up from his tablet, his brow furrowed. Helen handed Sarah the card with a jerky motion and quickly moved on, her shoulders stiff. Sarah placed the feedback card on her tray table, but didn't touch it. Instead, she stared out the window, a reflection in the glass, a picture of controlled strength. She had endured enough. Her patience, though vast, was not infinite. Reaching into her carry-on, Sarah retrieved her phone. She hesitated for a moment, considering the weight of what she was about to do. She rarely leveraged her position, preferring to let her actions speak for her, but Helen's behavior had crossed too many lines. She dialed a number and pressed the phone to her ear, her voice low as she spoke. This is Sarah. Yes, I need you to contact the airline's senior management immediately. Tell them it's urgent. I'll hold. The call was brief, her tone calm but resolute. When she ended the call, she placed the phone back in her bag and folded her hands in her lap, her expression unreadable. Not long after, The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be experiencing a slight delay upon landing. Thank you for your patience. The announcement was standard enough, but Sarah noticed Helen's reaction immediately. The flight attendant stiffened, her eyes darting toward the galley, as though she had just received an unexpected message. She quickly disappeared from view, her previously smug demeanor replaced by a hint of unease. Sarah remained in her seat, her expression calm, but her mind alert. She knew the wheels had been set in motion. Helen returned to the cabin a few moments later, her steps slower, her smile forced. She approached Sarah's seat, the tray of service items in her hands trembling slightly. "Is there anything else I can get you, ma'am?" Helen asked, her voice lacking its earlier edge. Sarah regarded her for a long moment, letting the question hang in the air. "No, thank you," she said finally, her voice cool and measured. Helen lingered for a moment longer before retreating. Sarah could feel the tension radiating from her, a silent acknowledgement that something had shifted. As the plane began its descent, Sarah closed her book and tucked it back into her carry-on. She straightened her blazer and smoothed her skirt, her movements deliberate and calm. She could feel the stares of the other passengers, their curiosity piqued by the subtle but unmistakable shift in the atmosphere. Helen passed by once more, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes betrayed her unease. Sarah met her gaze briefly before turning back to the window. The landing gear engaged with a soft thud, and the plane began its final approach. Sarah exhaled slowly, her hands resting lightly on the armrests. Justice was close, and Sarah was ready. The plane's wheels kissed the runway with a soft jolt, the cabin filling with the familiar sound of reversing thrusters and deceleration. Sarah remained composed, her hands resting lightly on her lap. The tension in the first-class cabin had grown palpable, like a taut wire ready to snap. Helen's presence loomed nearby as she began her post-landing duties, her movements stiff and mechanical. Sarah could see the cracks in her composure, the slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted the overhead compartments. The sharp, smug air Helen had carried earlier had faded, replaced by a quiet unease. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom, calm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived at our destination. Please remain seated as we taxi to the gate. A special team from our corporate office will be meeting this flight upon arrival. Thank you for flying with us." The words hung in the air, their weight heavier than their neutrality suggested. Sarah caught the flicker of recognition in Helen's eyes as she paused mid-step. The subtle shift in Helen's posture, a sudden stiffness in her shoulders, was telling. Sarah allowed herself the faintest smile, a quiet acknowledgement of the inevitable. The plane came to a halt, and the cabin lights brightened. Passengers began unbuckling their seat belts and reaching for their belongings, the usual buzz of post-flight activity filling the space. Sarah stayed seated, her movements deliberate as she retrieved her carry-on from under the seat. She knew what was coming, and there was no need to rush. Helen lingered at the front of the cabin, her eyes darting toward the jet bridge, as though searching for an escape. But escape was no longer an option. The door to the cabin opened with a hiss, and a small team of sharply dressed airline executives stepped aboard. Their presence was immediate and commanding, their polished appearances standing in stark contrast to the casual chaos of disembarking passengers. At the front of the group was a tall man in his late 40s, his tailored suit impeccable, his expression neutral but firm. Sarah recognized him immediately, Peter Kent, the airline's senior vice president of operations. "Good afternoon," Peter said, his voice carrying easily over the soft murmurs of the cabin. "Could I have a word with our first-class staff, please?" Helen froze, her face paling visibly. She glanced toward the galley, as if considering retreating, but there was nowhere to go. "Of course," she said finally, her voice trembling slightly. She approached Peter with forced composure, her smile faltering. Sarah remained seated, her posture straight and her gaze steady. She watched as Peter spoke quietly to Helen, his voice too low for the other passengers to hear. Helen's expression shifted rapidly, her eyes widening, her lips parting in protest. "I assure you, there's been a misunderstanding," Helen said, her voice rising slightly. "I was simply doing my job." Peter held up a hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. His calm demeanor only seemed to heighten the weight of his words. "We've received multiple complaints about your behavior on this flight, Helen," Peter said evenly. and we've reviewed the initial report filed by our team in real time. Helen's face flushed deeply, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. I didn't. This isn't the first time we've had issues raised about your conduct, Helen, Peter interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. We take matters like this very seriously. I'm afraid we'll need to discuss this further once we're back at the office. Helen's gaze flickered to Sarah, her expression a mixture of anger and fear. For a brief moment, it looked as though she might protest, but the words seemed to die in her throat. As the executives turned to leave, Peter paused, his eyes landing on Sarah. His expression softened slightly, and he nodded in her direction. Miss Bloom, I'd like to personally apologize for the experience you've had on today's flight, Peter said, his voice sincere. Please know that we are taking this matter very seriously and will be implementing corrective measures immediately. Sarah inclined her head gracefully. I appreciate that, Mr. Kent, she replied, her voice steady. But I hope this isn't just about me. Behavior like this affects more people than you might realize. Peter nodded solemnly. You're absolutely right. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. Helen was escorted off the plane by one of the executives, her head bowed, her shoulders slumped. The passengers in the first-class cabin exchanged glances, their curiosity now mingled with a sense of vindication. Sarah stood slowly, gathering her belongings. As she moved toward the exit, several passengers murmured words of support, their gestures small but genuine. You handled that with grace, the man who had been seated beside her said softly as she passed. Sarah smiled faintly. Thank you, she replied, her tone warm but firm. As Sarah stepped into the terminal, the weight of the day began to lift. She felt no need for triumph or celebration. Justice had been served, and that was enough. She walked with her head held high, her carry-on gliding smoothly behind her, a quiet symbol of her resilience. She had faced adversity, met it head-on, and emerged unshaken. For Sarah, this was more than a personal victory. It was a reminder that dignity and composure could dismantle even the most insidious forms of prejudice. And as she made her way toward the exit, the faintest smile touched her lips, a quiet acknowledgement of the power she carried within her. The terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of arrivals and departures, but for Sarah, the world outside the glass walls of the airport felt quieter. The tension from the flight lingered like an unwelcome guest, but the resolution had brought a sense of balance. She walked with purpose, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor, her carry-on rolling smoothly behind her. As she moved toward the baggage claim, her mind replayed the final moments of the flight, Helen's flushed face, the weight of Peter Kent's words, and the quiet murmurs of support from her fellow passengers. All wove together into a tapestry of change. Yet Sarah knew this wasn't just about one flight or one person. It was about something far bigger, a fight that never truly ended. Near the baggage carousel, a voice broke through her thoughts. Excuse me, ma'am? Sarah turned to see a young black woman in her mid-20s, dressed in business casual attire. She clutched a worn leather briefcase, her expression a mixture of nervousness and admiration. Yes, Sarah replied, her tone warm but measured. I just wanted to say, I saw what happened on the flight, the woman said hesitantly. You handled that with so much grace. I don't think I could have stayed that composed. Sarah smiled faintly, her eyes softening. Thank you, but it wasn't just for me. Sometimes you have to make a stand, even when it feels uncomfortable. The woman nodded, her expression brightening. You inspired me. People like you make me feel like I can keep going, even when it's hard. Sarah placed a hand lightly on the woman's shoulder. You can, she said firmly, and you will. But remember, you don't have to carry it all alone. Find your allies, and let them stand with you. The woman's eyes glistened as she nodded. Thank you, she said softly. As Sarah collected her luggage and exited the terminal, her phone buzzed. She retrieved it from her pocket, glancing at the screen. It was a call from Peter Kent. She answered, her voice steady. This is Sarah. Miss Bloom. Peter's voice came through, respectful but cautious. I hope this isn't an inconvenient time. I wanted to follow up on today's incident and let you know the steps we're taking. Go on, Sarah said, her tone inviting but firm. We've officially suspended Helen from all duties, pending a full review, Peter explained. Additionally, we'll be conducting mandatory sensitivity training for our staff, with a focus on addressing unconscious bias and discriminatory behavior. This isn't just about today. It's about ensuring this doesn't happen again. Sarah nodded to herself, appreciating the accountability. That's a good start, she replied. But it's only the beginning. Policies and training are necessary, but the culture needs to change too. That's a deeper issue, and it will take more than a one-time effort. You're absolutely right, Peter admitted. We've also reached out to consult with organizations that specialize in diversity and equity to guide us in making systemic changes. Your feedback has been invaluable, Miss Bloom. I hope we can count on you to continue providing insights as we move forward. Sarah's lips curved into a faint smile. I appreciate that, Mr. Kent. I'll hold you to your word. A car Peter had arranged was waiting just outside the terminal. As she slid into the back seat, the city skyline came into view, glowing softly against the evening sky. The driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, greeted her politely and began the journey toward her destination. Sarah stared out the window, her mind quiet for the first time since the flight. She thought about Helen, about the passengers who had spoken up, and about the young woman at the baggage claim. Each of them represented a thread in the larger fabric of change. Some threads were tangled, others frayed, but together, they formed a tapestry of progress. Sarah knew her role was just one piece of that tapestry, but she also knew the power of a single thread. Her thoughts drifted to her parents, their quiet resilience and unwavering belief in justice. She could almost hear her father's voice, soft but firm, reminding her that dignity wasn't just about how you carried yourself. It was about how you lifted others. As the car pulled up to her hotel, Sarah stepped out, her carry-on trailing behind her. The doorman greeted her with a smile, opening the door to the grand lobby. She moved through the space with the same quiet confidence that had carried her through the day, her presence drawing subtle but respectful glances. Once in her room, Sarah set her luggage aside and walked to the large window overlooking the city. The view was breathtaking, the lights shimmering like stars against the darkened sky. She stood there for a long moment, her reflection blending with the cityscape. Today had been difficult, but it had also been a reminder of why she fought, why she endured. Every act of resistance, no matter how small, chipped away at the barriers that sought to hold her back. Sarah closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, she allowed herself a moment of stillness, a moment of gratitude. And as she opened her eyes, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Justice wasn't just something she sought, it was something she embodied. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains of Sarah's hotel room, illuminating the calm space with a soft, golden hue. Sarah sat at the edge of the bed, her feet planted firmly on the carpeted floor, a steaming cup of coffee in her hand. The events of the previous day lingered in her mind, but the heaviness had given way to clarity. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She reached for it, noticing a series of notifications. Among them was a message from Peter Kent. Miss Bloom, an internal meeting has been scheduled for later this week to discuss systemic changes to our first-class policies and training protocols. Your insights during this process would be invaluable. Please let us know if you'd be willing to participate. Sarah read the message twice, considering her response. She appreciated the initiative, but experience had taught her to be cautious. Words often came easier than action. She typed a reply, her fingers moving deliberately over the screen. Thank you, Mr. Kent. I'm willing to participate, but I hope this initiative includes voices beyond mine. The experiences of others, staff and passengers alike, should inform these changes. She pressed send and set the phone aside. Her role in this wasn't about personal vindication. It was about leveraging her position to create lasting change. Later at the hotel's cafe, the scent of freshly baked pastries and brewed coffee greeted her as she stepped into the cozy space. She ordered a light breakfast and took a seat near the window, where she could watch the city come to life. As she sipped her coffee, a familiar face entered the cafe. It was the young woman from the baggage claim, her briefcase still in hand, her expression lighting up as she spotted Sarah. Miss Bloom? The woman said hesitantly, approaching her table. Sarah smiled warmly and gestured to the seat across from her. Please, call me Sarah. And join me if you'd like. The woman sat down, her movements careful, as though she didn't want to impose. I hope I'm not bothering you, she said. Not at all, Sarah replied. It's nice to see you again. What brings you here? The woman hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her briefcase. Well, after yesterday, I wanted to thank you again. I didn't get the chance to tell you how much your composure meant to me. Sarah tilted her head slightly, studying the woman's earnest expression. It wasn't just about composure, she said gently. It was about making sure that behavior didn't go unchecked. The woman nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. I know, and it inspired me to address something I've been avoiding. She hesitated before continuing. I work in a corporate office, where microaggressions happen all the time. I've always brushed them off, telling myself it wasn't worth the fight. But seeing you yesterday, it made me realize that silence doesn't change anything. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. It's not easy to speak up, she said, but every step matters, no matter how small. And you don't have to do it alone. The woman's eyes glistened, her expression softening. Thank you. That's exactly what I needed to hear. As they talked, Sarah's phone buzzed again. She glanced at it briefly, her eyes narrowing at the sender's name. It was an email from Helen. Curiosity piqued. Sarah excused herself briefly to read the message. Subject, my apologies. Dear Miss Bloom, I want to sincerely apologize for my behavior on the flight yesterday. I realize my actions were unprofessional and disrespectful. There's no excuse for how I treated you, and I'm truly sorry. I've been given a chance to reflect, and I understand that my attitude must change. I hope you can accept my apology. Sincerely, Helen. Sarah set the phone down, her expression thoughtful. The apology was unexpected, but appreciated. Still, she couldn't ignore the fact that it had come after disciplinary action, not before. Returning her attention to the young woman, Sarah decided to share the email. Sometimes, change starts with accountability, she said, showing her the message. But real growth takes more than words. The woman read the email, her eyes widening slightly. Do you think she means it? Sarah considered the question for a moment. I hope so, she said, but time will tell. As the day unfolded, Sarah received more messages, some from fellow passengers who had witnessed the events on the flight, others from acquaintances who had heard about it through their networks. Each message carried a common thread, gratitude and a call for change. Sarah responded to each one thoughtfully, taking the time to acknowledge their support and emphasize the importance of collective action. By evening, she found herself back at the hotel, sitting by the window with a notebook in hand. She began jotting down ideas, ways the airline could improve its policies, training modules that focused on empathy, and strategies for ensuring accountability at every level. Her notes became a blueprint, a foundation for the meeting she had agreed to attend. As the city lights twinkled outside her window, Sarah leaned back in her chair, her pen resting on the page. She felt a quiet sense of purpose, a reminder that her actions had sparked something larger than herself. She thought about the young woman, about Helen, and about the many people who had reached out to her. Each interaction had reinforced her belief in the power of standing up, not just for herself, but for others who couldn't yet find their voices. Justice, Sarah realized, wasn't a destination. It was a journey, one she was willing to walk, no matter how long it took. And as she closed her notebook, her resolve solidified. The ripple she had created would continue to spread, touching lives in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace, knowing that the fight for change was just beginning. Martha arrived at the airline's corporate headquarters 2 weeks later, her presence as poised and commanding as ever. The modern, glass building stood tall against the city skyline, a reflection of progress and power. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but purposeful, with executives and staff bustling to prepare for the day's meeting. A young assistant greeted her at the entrance, wide-eyed and deferential. Miss Bloom, welcome, he said, extending a hand. Thank you for coming. Mr. Kent is expecting you. Martha smiled politely, shaking his hand before following him into the conference room. The space was sleek and minimalistic, with a large table at its center. A dozen senior executives, including Peter Kent, were already seated. Their expressions ranged from cautious optimism to genuine respect as she entered. Miss Bloom, Peter said, standing to greet her. Thank you for making the time. We're eager to hear your perspective. Martha inclined her head, taking a seat at the table. Thank you for inviting me. I hope this discussion will lead to meaningful action, not just surface-level changes. The conversation began with a review of the steps the airline had taken since the incident. Peter outlined the suspension of Helen, the implementation of mandatory diversity training, and the hiring of external consultants to audit the company's practices. Martha listened intently, her expression neutral, but her mind sharp. When Peter finished, she leaned forward, her hands folded neatly on the table. "These are good first steps," she began, her voice calm but firm. "But they don't address the deeper issue. This isn't just about individual behavior. It's about the culture that allows it to happen." The room fell silent, all eyes on her. She continued, her tone steady. "How are you ensuring that marginalized voices are heard, not just in the passenger cabin, but within your staff and leadership? What systems are in place to hold people accountable, beyond a single training session?" One of the executives, a middle-aged man with a cautious demeanor, cleared his throat. "We're working on policies to address these issues," he said. "But it's a process." Martha met his gaze directly. "A process is only as effective as the commitment behind it," she said. "It's not enough to react when a problem arises. You need to be proactive, creating an environment where discrimination isn't just addressed, but prevented." Toward the end of the meeting, Peter brought up a sensitive topic. "Miss Bloom, I wanted to inform you that Helen has requested a follow-up meeting to apologize to you in person. She has voluntarily enrolled in additional training and expressed a desire to make amends." Martha considered his words carefully. She didn't relish confrontation, but she knew the value of accountability. "I'm willing to meet with her," she said finally, "but only if it's clear that this isn't about clearing her conscience. It's about genuine change." Peter nodded. "Understood. We'll arrange it." A week later, Martha met Helen in a quiet, neutral office space within the airline's headquarters. Helen entered hesitantly, her usual confidence replaced with visible vulnerability. Her eyes darted nervously to Martha before she took a seat across from her. "Miss Bloom," Helen began, her voice trembling slightly, "I want to thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I owe you an apology. More than that, I owe you the truth." Martha remained silent, allowing Helen to continue. "I've spent the past few weeks reflecting on my behavior," Helen said. "I realized that my actions weren't just about ignorance. They were about prejudice I hadn't confronted in myself. I know that my apology can't undo what I did, but I'm committed to being better, not just for myself, but for everyone I interact with." Martha studied her carefully, searching for sincerity. "Acknowledging your biases is a start," she said, "but actions speak louder than words. Are you prepared to do the work it takes to change?" Helen nodded, her eyes glistening. "Yes, I am. I'm ready." In the months that followed, Martha continued to work with the airline as a consultant, helping them implement new policies and training programs. Her influence extended beyond the corporate office. Her story inspired a broader conversation about systemic change in the travel industry. Helen, true to her word, became an advocate for equity within the airline. She spoke openly about her journey, using her experience as a cautionary tale and a call to action. Over time, she earned back the trust of her colleagues and passengers, proving that redemption was possible when paired with genuine effort. One evening, months after the initial incident, Martha stood at a podium in front of a packed auditorium. She had been invited to speak at a leadership summit, her reputation as a champion for justice preceding her. "Change isn't easy," she told the audience. "It's uncomfortable, messy, and often slow. But it's necessary, and it starts with each of us choosing to see, choosing to listen, and choosing to act." Her words resonated deeply, the applause echoing through the room as she stepped away from the podium. As she exited the stage, she felt a sense of fulfillment. The ripples she had created on that flight had grown into waves, touching lives she would never know. For Martha, the fight for justice wasn't over, but she had proven that one voice, when used with courage and conviction, could spark a movement. And that, she thought, was worth every battle. Martha's strength and determination proved that even in the face of prejudice, justice can prevail. Her actions not only held individuals accountable, but also ignited meaningful change within an entire organization. This isn't just her story. It's a powerful reminder of how one voice can inspire progress. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. By joining us, you'll stay connected to more stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us of the power of resilience. Thank you for watching, and I can't wait to share another impactful story with you soon.